Kia ora everyone. My name is David and I am a PhD student here at the University of Waikato. This is joint work with my supervisor on Trye. Technically, I'm a computer science student, but my PhD involves using language data primarily to explore and analyze different techniques for visualizing complex data sets. So I'd like to stress that this talk reflects work in progress, but hopefully it will still give you an appreciation for what we're trying to do and why. And of course, I'd be very grateful to hear any feedback or suggestions at the end. So let's get underway. In this talk, I'm going to introduce a new approach to studying loanwords or borrowings at a macro discourse level. To demonstrate this, we're going to look at a case study of Māori loanwords in New Zealand English. So firstly, some context for this research. Linguists generally study loanwords either by analysing types and tokens of borrowed words in a corpus or by comparing type-token frequency with near synonyms from the receiver language. In both cases, the main unit of measurement is frequency of use, and each loanword is examined independently from the others. However, because words tend to follow recurring patterns involving the same words, it makes sense to study groups of loanwords as well as loanwords in isolation. Of course, this concept has long been applied to grammar, looking at collocates and constructions of varying length, but it hasn't actually been investigated in relation to loanwords. And we know, for instance, that the word mātauranga occurs more often with Māori than any other word. But going further than that, recurring patterns don't only have to involve directly adjacent neighbours. Two related words may not necessarily occur near each other within a text. They could be separated by several sentences or even a number of paragraphs. Again, this is true of borrowings as well. A text that mentions iwi at the beginning might also mention marae somewhere in the middle and tikanga at the end. Our work arises from the observation that New Zealand English texts seem to either contain several loanwords or none at all. This has been noted in children's picture books, and my personal belief is that New Zealand English speakers tend to either actively use loanwords or not for various sociolinguistic reasons. In light of this, we wanted to come up with a way to package loanword co-occurrence by considering each text as a whole so that we could study the resulting sets of loanwords and see if any interesting patterns emerge. Take, for instance, AdConc, which allows you to produce concordances for different keywords. The screenshot here shows instances of a keyword in a corpus together with their surrounding context. Concordances are usually operationalized a priori with a specified window size, for instance, 8 words to the left or right of the keyword. However, the texts that we analyze are typically much larger than this window and may differ in length. Unfortunately, this means that a standard concordance doesn't support analysis at a macro discourse level because there's no easy way to change the window size dynamically for each text. So let's define collotextualisation in relation to some existing terms. Collocation can be defined as the company a word keeps. For example, the words collateral and damage often occur together, and then we have words like crystal clear, nuclear family, etc. Collocation networks are sometimes visualized using tools such as Landsbox. Collostruction parallels the notion of collocation concerning words that co-occur with certain grammatical constructions. So, for example, the noun accident is strongly associated with the construction waiting to happen. Collotextualisation, which we propose in this talk, captures words that co-occur anywhere within the same text, regardless of length. So while collocation provides insights into the lexicon and collostruction allows us to study interactions between the lexicon and the syntax, collotextualisation encapsulates interactions between the lexicon and the greater discourse. We're going to test this idea with New Zealand English loanwords because we think this fits the method well. So a bit of background about the loanword situation in New Zealand English for those who are unfamiliar. A myriad of genres have been studied over the years, including newspaper corpora, spoken language, news broadcasts, picture books, and more recently, social media. New Zealand English constitutes an interesting case study because there is an unusually productive lexical transfer from the donor language, Māori, to the receiver language, English. Studies have shown that loanword use is generally increasing, especially when it comes to social culture terms, so words like whānau, family, and aroha, love. However, loanword use is skewed across both speakers and topics, with Māori women and Māori topics producing the highest loanword counts. Our overarching research question for this talk is, what can collotextualisation tell us about Māori loanword use in New Zealand English? More specifically, we'd like to know what loanword groupings or networks can be detected by taking this discourse-oriented approach, and what studying these networks actually tells us about the borrowing process that we couldn't learn from frequency alone. In terms of data, our analysis is based on 3 existing corpora of New Zealand English newspaper articles. Because we're dealing with newspaper articles, the vast majority of texts are formal, highly edited, prescriptive, and tend to follow social norms. The first 2 corpora listed here, the Māori Language Week, or MLW corpus, and Matariki corpus, are constrained by topics related to Māori language and culture, which means they're skewed towards high loanword use in general. Furthermore, because of the way they were sampled, these corpora also privilege a small number of loanwords over all others. So for instance, all texts in the Matariki corpus necessarily contain the loanword Matariki. In contrast, our third corpus, the press corpus, isn't constrained by topic, so has a much lower loanword rate, and it's sampled over a longer period of time. So you can see that all 3 corpora overlap diachronically, at least in part, facilitating a direct comparison across those years. Sadly, there's limited metadata available about the sociolinguistic profile of each author, so we've had to make do without that. Okay, so we've had an overview of the data. Now, what did we do with it? How did we instantiate this idea of collotextualisation? Well, in order to study loanword co-occurrence in our corpora, we first needed to pull out all the loanwords. So we used some existing code to generate a list of legitimate Māori words used in each corpus. I'd like to acknowledge Te Hiku Media, because the code that we used as our template was written by them and made available through their Ngākupu repository on GitHub. Essentially, the script identifies words that are orthographically consistent with Māori and then verifies them using the online Māori dictionary. After running the code, it became clear that some of these words were not being used as individual loanwords, but rather as part of a larger Māori phrase, or in some cases, a substantial chunk of Māori text. Accordingly, we expanded our search to include consecutive Māori words, so engrams of different sizes. Whereas previously, we only had a list of individual words, engrams of size 1, we now added terms like te reo Māori, kapahaka, etc. Next, we calculated the frequency of each engram across our 3 corpora and sorted them in a prioritized list. I should point out that engrams embedded inside larger engrams were only counted as part of the largest engram. So for example, our counts for Māori don't include instances that were part of the phrase te reo Māori, which is an engram in its own right. We then refined our list of engrams by manually inspecting the list, because we found that not all engrams were actually being used as loanwords. For example, some words referred to specific individuals because they were also people's names, and some place names didn't constitute a meaningful linguistic choice because there was no suitable native English alternative. So we kept words like Aotearoa, New Zealand, but not those which didn't have an English counterpart. There were also some Māori words that share the same phonotactics as much more common English words, take, more, and hope. Finally, we removed loanwords that occurred fewer than 5 times across our 3 corpora because these tended not to be used in relevant contexts. This left us with 140 loanwords in total, which you can see in this word cloud. We've also tagged each engram for various linguistic properties so that we can find out how these correlate with the loanword sets in each text. So the semantic category of the loanword is whether it's a social culture term, flora and fauna, material culture, etc., which follows categories proposed by McAllister. Semantic type follows Myers-Scotton, and this is categories such as core or cultural. In our case, we actually also added proper nouns because these didn't really fit into either of those categories. Size is the number of words in the engram, and finally listedness is simply whether the loanword is listed in the Oxford Dictionary of New Zealand English. We then extracted the complete set of engrams used in each text by building a co-occurrence matrix for each corpus. So here the rows correspond to the different texts and the columns are the different loanwords. so the 140 loanwords in our set. Additionally, the first engram to appear in the text was recorded as the trigger loan because we thought there might be some sort of activation or priming effect whereby the use of one loanword is likely to trigger the use of several others. And this raises interesting questions as well about the linguistic properties of the loanwords that follow the trigger loan. Is it the case that if the first loanword is a social culture term, all subsequent loanwords are likely to also be social culture terms? We then calculated several metrics from the engram perspective in the hope that these could tell us something about the influence or position of the loanwords in their co-occurrence networks. So here we can see total sets is the number of texts where the loanword occurs with at least one other. Distinct sets is the number of different combinations for each of those sets, because sometimes the same set occurs multiple times. Degree is the number of neighbours or other engrams that the engram co-occurs with in at least one text. Average frequency tells us on average how many times each set combination involving the given engram occurs. And average length is the average number of engrams in each set, which ranges between about 2 and 20. And then we've got trigger occurrences, which is the number of times the engram was the first to appear in the text. So for most engrams, this is actually 0, although that's not reflected in this over here. So we think that our metrics are useful because they provide a measure of entrenchment for these loanwords. So now for some results. This bar graph on the left shows the number of engrams that occur in each text. So another way of looking at this is the length of the set. At first glance, there are quite a few texts with just one loanword, contrary to what we were expecting. But actually, if we group all of these green bars together, producing this graph on the right, then we find that there are many texts with 2 or more loanwords than only one, many more texts with 2 or more loanwords than only one. Here we have a network showing loanword co-occurrence at the text level. So this particular network shows the top 20 loanwords in the Matariki corpus, excluding Matariki itself. So each node represents an engram, and 2 engrams are connected if they co-occur in 1 or more texts, with the thickness of each edge being proportional to the number of texts that they share. So notice the strong relationships here between Māori and whānau and Māori and kapahaka. And we can see also that Māori is the most frequent loanword in the corpus, as shown by node size. So one of the limitations of this network is that it doesn't show the exact combinations of loanwords in each text or the number of times that they occur. So this is because it flattens the data into pairwise co-occurrences. We can see, for instance, that Māori and whānau occur together a lot, but we don't know if when they do occur, there are other loanwords that are also present, either sometimes or all of the time. So we can get around this by using a so-called hypergraph, whose edges connect multiple nodes instead of just 2. This preserves the set memberships, allowing us to analyze, among other things, the average number of loanwords per set, how often each set occurs, and the most frequent combinations. So the visualization here shows all sets involving the loanword mokopuna, grandchildren, in the MRW corpus. And we can see that there are 11 sets in total. The engrams are arranged in order of importance on the left-hand side, and sets are represented as these vertical lines. So importance in this case means the loanwords that co-occur with mokopuna in a larger number of sets, in a larger number of texts, essentially. So overall, looking beyond the mokopuna sets, we find that each engram occurs in a set with 6 others on average. This reinforces the idea that loanwords occur in groups rather than in isolation. We also find that infrequent loanwords tend to cluster around frequent loanwords. For example, we can see that every set that contains mokopuna, which is considered infrequent, also contains Māori, and all but 4 also contain Te Reo. This is consistent with the notion that loanwords might occur in vocabulary frequency bands as proposed for measuring our 2 vocabulary. And just another point, infrequent loanwords tend not to occur in small sets, unlike frequent loanwords. So here you can see that all sets involving mokopuna are relatively large. In this slide, we see that frequent loanwords take part in more relationships than infrequent ones because n-gram frequency is positively correlated with set frequency. This perhaps isn't too surprising given that loanwords that occur more often have more opportunity to co-occur with other loanwords in different texts. So this graph is just for the MLW corpus and shows all of the data points, whereas the one over here, I've just removed the four loanwords with the largest values so that we can see the overall trend more clearly. So we've also done a preliminary analysis on the trigger loans, so the first loanword to occur in each text. So here are the top 16 trigger loan types. We find that frequent n-grams are typically the first to occur in a given text. The top 4 trigger loans, Māori, Kiwi, Matariki and Te Reo, actually constitute 60% of all trigger loan occurrences. Continuing our analysis, how do the different linguistic properties correlate with the trigger loans? So here we're looking at the trigger loan occurrences or tokens rather than the types. So this is a variation of a mosaic plot showing three-way interactions between n-gram size along the top, semantic category on the left, and semantic type along the bottom. I think I mentioned before that for semantic type, we added a third category, sorry, down here, because we had lots of proper nouns that didn't really fit into either of the others satisfactorily. And then with the semantic categories, we added expression for formulaic phrases. And because there were some ambiguous cases between categories, we also added social culture / material culture down here. In this graph, the size of each bar is proportional to the number of trigger loan occurrences with the corresponding properties. So this yellow bar is by far the highest, the largest, and it tells us that over half of the trigger loan occurrences are proper nouns of length 1. We can also see from this blue area that most trigger loan tokens are proper nouns or social culture terms, and in fact this accounts for 88% of the data. If we partition the data vertically, then we find that one-word trigger loans are by far the most common, and they constitute 83% of the data. In terms of semantic class, roughly 1/5 of trigger loan occurrences are core terms, another fifth are cultural, and the rest are the proper nouns. And finally, although listedness isn't plotted here, 80% of trigger loan occurrences are listed in the dictionary. Currently, we're doing a statistical cluster analysis to find out what the most frequent combinations and most similar loanword groupings are. So we want to see if we can build a hierarchy that tells us if a certain loanword is present in this text, which other loanwords are also likely to be present, if they have any sort of predictive power. We're also looking at the linguistic properties of each set in more detail, and we want to examine the sets diachronically to see how they change over time and if there are any notable patterns. And then we're comparing our 3 corpora and potentially also looking at other genres. In future work, we're wondering if there might be other groups of words apart from loanwords that might benefit from a macro discourse approach. So just to wrap up, we propose a new method for studying loanwords at a macro discourse level, which we've called Collotextualisation. The key idea here is that instead of limiting the analysis to nearby collocates, we look at the text as a whole and then extract a set of loanwords for each text, which we can analyse quantitatively. And when it comes to Māori loanwords in New Zealand English, it seems that the use of one loanword is likely to trigger the use of others. And this points to loanword use being an opt-in or opt-out affair rather than whereby speakers do not make individual word choices, but rather adopt loanwords as a set. And the motivation for this could be aligned more closely with ideology than bilingualism. So thank you all for listening. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Tahiki Media for the use of their code, Sally Harper and Kate Levendis for helping to put the data together, and finally the University of Waikato for funding this research through a doctoral scholarship. Thanks again.